When we talked about my coming here 4 or 5 months ago now, the world was a lot different, and the topic of the future of the multilateral trading system seemed like a nice academic subject. Little did we think that the leaders of the world's major economies would be meeting 2 days later in London to discuss one of the most dramatic downturns in the world economy since the Great Depression of almost 80 years ago. But here we are, and the situation in some respects makes this topic a little more timely, but it means that the focus has to be on not only where we're going in the future, but a reappraisal of where we are right now, so that we better understand what's going on and the importance of having a viable multilateral trading system to help reinforce efforts to recover from this very deep economic hole that we are in today. There are a number of things happening now that will affect the analysis. World trade is contracting very sharply. The World Trade Organization estimated just last week that world trade will fall by 9% in 2009. And it was just a year and a half ago, in 2007, that world trade was growing at a 6% annual rate. So you have a 15% swing in world trade, and that's pretty sharp contraction in a short period of time. We have, as is normal when you have sharp economic downturns, an increase in protectionism. And this was something that the G20 summit leaders discussed when they met in Washington last November. They pledged to avoid new protectionism, but that commitment was misunderstood and misapplied. It was supposed to be more than a pledge to honor existing WTO commitments during the crisis. It was meant to point out, to spell out the objective that countries should avoid measures that distort international trade and investment, whether they are WTO legal or not. And the WTO allows a lot of legal protectionism that I'll get to in a little bit. Because any measures like that, whether it be the Buy American provisions that the United States included in its domestic stimulus legislation last month, or other measures that are being imposed by the European Union or Indonesia or India or Argentina, all these complicate the task of managing the recovery from the global recession. Now, most G20 countries who took that pledge in November have violated it. They have violated the political commitment, and the United States is one of the main culprits. So this is something that will get a great deal of attention when the leaders reconvene in London later this week. At the same time, the downturn in the world economy, the increase in protectionism, the contraction in world trade, none of this spells is good news for efforts to try to revive the current Doha round of multilateral trade negotiations. The Doha round is drifting. A multilateral trade deal is not possible in time to dig out of the current recession. Indeed, it'd be good to just revive it at all in the coming months. But accelerating progress on an ambitious and balanced result is important in these trade negotiations for two important reasons. One, to deflect protectionist pressures, and two, to maintain the viability of a multilateral negotiating process. It's now clear, and this is something that I have tried to convey to WTO ambassadors in Geneva for quite some time, and it's not well understood there. It's quite clear that the status quo on trade policy is not sustainable, and that if multilateral negotiations fail or even continue to drift, markets will become less open to international competition, and the viability of the multilateral negotiating process will be called into question, including the WTO's valuable dispute settlement mechanism. So this is a problem. The downside risk of inaction, which we have seen for much of the last 4 or 5 months, the downside risk is great because the forces of economic nationalism propelled by rising unemployment and shrinking output could lead to new restrictions on trade and investment that inhibit recovery today and clog the arteries of potential growth in the future. That's essentially the challenge that the G20 leaders are facing as they convene in London, and there will be some rancor about the macroeconomic policies that they are all pursuing and whether they're doing enough or in the right way to promote the most efficient means of recovery in their economies and in the world economy. I'd be happy to talk about that later, but I will focus my comments today exclusively on the trade side of the story. In talking about the trading system, I think it's important to give a little bit of historical context, and then I will mention a few things that are wrong with the trading system today, and a few ways that the system may be improved going forward. It's been 65 years since the Bretton Woods Conference set out the architecture for institutions that would help guide post-war reconstruction and development. But it took several years after that to flesh out what to do on trade. And the charter for an international trade organization only emerged from the Havana Conference in March of 1948. That's really the foundation of the post-war multilateral trading system. The ITO had a short and sad gestation. This is superbly documented by Bill Diebold, an old friend of mine from many years ago, in one of the very first Princeton essays in international finance. So if you know that wonderful series, you should go back to, I think, number 6, because it's a classic to explain the history of the ill-fated international trade organization. While the ITO was under negotiation, 23 countries signed an interim arrangement called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or the GATT, and applied it on a provisional basis pending adoption of the ITO, the International Trade Organization. The ITO never was ratified. The Congress had a lot of problems with it. It's a long story in itself. It never came up for a vote, and it died, or it was stillborn. And instead, we had the GATT, and the GATT was applied provisionally for 47 years. Now, it wasn't all that bad to have provisional application of the GATT. It worked well for several decades. It yielded 8 constructive rounds of multilateral trade negotiations during that period of time, between 1947 and 1994. The U.S. took the lead in cutting tariffs and other trade barriers and really gave a big push to the development of the multilateral trading system. But as the tariff liberalization cut deeper into what I would call the muscle of protection, there was much more resistance in the United States and in other countries, especially as Europe and Japan's recovery created formidable competitors at home and abroad. And so there was increasing resistance to moving forward in the GATT era. The great triumph of the GATT era was creating a prosperous multipolar trading system from essentially what was a unipolar system that emerged from World War II. It was just the United States with the viable economy. And the early decades of the GATT could really be called the age of U.S. enlightened self-interest, because the first 4 rounds of GATT negotiations, the multilateral negotiations, if you look at it, effectively it involved the United States cutting its own tariffs very dramatically for the benefit of the rest of the world. That's what the first 10 years of the GATT was about, very dramatic cuts in U.S. protection. At the same time, the United States deployed generous development aid in tandem with the extensive liberalization of trade barriers, and that helped revive and rebuild the war-torn economies of Western Europe, and thus provide a stable economic base for democratic governance and a reliable buffer against Soviet expansionism. So in those early decades of the GATT, U.S. policies were generous to its former military foes and strongly supported the evolving European community. If you went to Congress today and said U.S. foreign policy interests were a large component of U.S. commercial policy in the post-war period, they'd say, well, we don't want any of that anymore. And that could be one of the major problems we have, the more parochial view of international trade that the Congress holds today, and not having, and the Congress not learning the lessons of the post-war experience of U.S. trade policy, which benefited us greatly at the same time that we helped use trade policy to rebuild our allies. Now, the one thing about this period, which is important to understand some of the tensions in the current trading system, is that U.S. policy, and to some extent European policy, was generous to a fault to developing countries. And during this period, they basically permitted developing countries to free ride on the trading system without undertaking substantive commitments to reduce their own barriers to their own market. U.S. and European trade barriers came down sharply during the 8 rounds of GATT negotiations, leaving only a small number of important trade restrictions that benefit well-entrenched domestic interest groups. And you think about it, if you've survived 8 attempts to cut your protection, there's probably some pretty strong political forces behind the maintenance of those barriers. Agriculture was a notable exception to this reformist trend. So too was textiles and clothing, at least until the multi-fiber arrangement rusted away in 2005. But I think this sets out a key problem we have. The United States and Europe cut back almost all of their barriers, very open markets, with a few notable exceptions. And what is left to give in the mercantilist sense of a international trade negotiation? For the United States and the European Union, it's just the most difficult politically difficult changes in policy that have been immune to reform over the past 4 or 5 decades. So there's not much left to give except the hard stuff. And if you're going to change those practices, you're going to have a big payoff to get the political support to do so. And that's part of the challenge of the international trade negotiations. Now, we had all of this in the GATT era, but I can tell you from personal experience, there is no free lunch in the GATT cafeteria. The cost of non-participation in the reciprocal negotiations, at least until the Uruguay round in the late 80s and early 90s, was significant. The GATT rounds left intact major barriers imposed by the industrial countries that restricted competitive agricultural and manufactured exports of developing countries. Thus, developing countries protected their own markets, but in turn had to accept the maintenance of high foreign trade barriers against their most competitive exports. Though such policies never yielded big economic rewards, they were politically convenient for both developed and developing countries. Many developing countries relied on protected home markets and commodity exports to support modest growth. Some followed a strategy of export-led growth and became platforms for the assembly and export of light manufacturers. Their success, in turn, provoked a wave of new protectionism in developed markets via so-called voluntary export restraints, anti-dumping duties, countervailing duties, and special protection regimes like the multi-fiber arrangement. And so that was the great bargain for developing countries. They were excused from taking obligations, and they got discriminated against. It wasn't such a great bargain, and again, laid the seeds of dissatisfaction that showed up in the 21st century negotiations. Now, the Uruguay round deviated from this pattern a bit by requiring that all issues under negotiation be considered as part of a single undertaking, which meant that you had to agree to everything on the table, everything in the package, or nothing was agreed. And the GATT has always worked on a consensus basis, so everybody had to agree or at least not disagree. It would seem like a rather unwieldy process, but few countries really wanted to block an overall agreement and face the political anger of their trading partners. But this single undertaking dramatically reversed past negotiating dynamics. Developing countries could no longer be free riders. And then, in the middle of the Uruguay round, when a new proposal came out to say, listen, we've got this provisional GATT, let's turn it into a formal international institution called the World Trade Organization. The agreement to institutionalize the trading system really changed the dynamics of how countries interacted in the trading system. Suddenly, developing countries had to accept the full complement of obligations, albeit with some special and differential treatment, to qualify for membership in the new WTO. If they didn't, then the U.S. and the European Union and Japan would go off to the new club, and the developing countries would be left on their own and discriminated against. So saying no to the Uruguay round agreements was not an option, since all the big trading powers were switching to the new club. Changing institutions put developing countries in a unique and disadvantageous position, and explains why they had to undertake commitments in some areas, such as intellectual property, that couldn't be fully implemented and enforced. The WTO was thus born with a development deficit. And so you've probably read a lot about all of the problems developing countries had in trying to administer and enforce the extensive new rulemaking that came up in the Uruguay round. That is in part the reason, and I think it was to some extent inadvertent that the planners of the WTO thought they were just doing a good thing in creating a more legally tenable regime, and yet they were creating these negotiating dynamics that had much broader ranging implications. That's where we are in terms of setting up the WTO, which came into existence in January of 1995. There was a great promise of this new global trade institution, sort of trying to build it up in the model of the World Bank and the IMF, and try to raise the profile of the trade organization, restoring the potential of the stillborn ITO of almost 50 years before. But the WTO is now 14 years old and has yet to produce its first comprehensive trade accord. Like any teenager, it confronts growing pains and awkward social adjustments as it addresses the challenges of international commerce in the 21st century. And there are a lot of things wrong with the WTO that weren't adequately looked at by its architects. So I thought what I would do is spell out a couple of things that are wrong with the WTO and then tell you how to make them right. But then I started making the list, and I realized it's a pretty long list of things that are wrong with the WTO. So I'll look at the clock and I'll cut off the list if I go on too long. What's wrong with the WTO? I think some of the problems reside in the complex issues on the trade negotiating agenda. We're not just talking about cutting tariffs anymore. We're talking about domestic policies and how they affect international trade and investment, whether it be the subsidy issues that I dealt with almost 35 years ago, or government procurement, or customs, or now climate change policies that will have an impact on trade and investment. The agenda is much more complex. It's dealing with a wide range of issues, both in terms of measures and regulatory policies that traditional trade officials just are not competent to deal with. They don't have the level of technical expertise to talk about how the regulatory policies will affect trade and investment. And so this becomes a much more difficult venture. But perhaps the most difficult challenges that the trading system faces transcend the responsibilities of trade ministers and emanate from the economic and political environment in which trade policy operates. So when I look at my list of what's the problems that the WTO faces, first and foremost is the global economic and political environment. It has become increasingly unsettled due to both adjustment pressures emanating from globalization, including growing competition from China, and new security requirements that complicate and raise the cost of international commerce. Globalization pressures make policymakers more cautious about taking on additional adjustments via new trade liberalization when they already are having a hard time coping with existing competition. This is true for the United States and Europe. You can imagine it's true for the smaller countries in Africa that are having a hard time just dealing with globalization as a whole and don't want to or can't imagine how they could add on the burden of additional adjustment that would have come if their markets were opened up more fully to trade and investment from foreign firms. This is a big challenge. But there is a globalization imperative to continue to improve the efficiency and productivity of your economy, because if you don't, you're going to fall much further behind in the race to maintain market share and to attract investment. So this is a big challenge. It's a big problem for developing countries. The second problem is that there always had been a foreign policy imperative to work together, and this was most evident just 8 years ago when the Doha round really was created in the aftermath of, or 2 months after the terrible attacks of 9/11. Now, the foreign policy imperative to work together has frayed, and it's frayed amid frictions over U.S. policy in Iraq, increasing competitive pressures from China, and renewed concerns about energy security and nuclear proliferation. The cooperative spirit of Doha in 2001, forged by the crisis of the moment, has become a fading memory. In its place, trade officials offer a cacophony of diplomatic rhetoric, which is known in Geneva as the blame game. It's the same game politicians play in Washington, so you're probably very familiar with it. It doesn't produce anything but except excess newsprint. And it's one of the reasons why we've had 8 years of negotiations in the Doha round and very little to show for it. The third problem, and this is directly related to the greater complexity of international trade and investment. There is a sizable gap in the ability of countries to participate actively in WTO deliberations, whether it be negotiations or even in the conduct of the committees of the WTO. Resource constraints are real, and many developing countries allocate the representation to regional bodies that offer more immediate payoffs in terms of unilateral trade preferences. If you go to Geneva, you won't see that many African ambassadors. They're all sitting in Brussels, where they get big handouts of financial aid and unilateral trade preferences. That's where the payoff comes from them. Sitting in Geneva doesn't give them that immediate financial payoff. Unfortunately, this leads to foot dragging in the WTO. And of course, developing countries also drag their feet because they're unsure whether they could take advantage of the new trading opportunities that new trade reforms would create due to infrastructure and human capital constraints. These legitimate concerns underscore the need for complementary commitments to aid for trade to strengthen economic infrastructure and administrative capabilities of these countries. And in essence, what this is really saying is this is not a trade problem. This is an international development problem of which international trade is only one part of the story. It's instructive to note that developing countries insisted that the Doha round be officially called the Doha Development Agenda, as if a trade negotiation could accomplish or require the coordination of policies that had failed governments throughout the post-war periods to integrate their trade, finance, and development strategies. We can talk about this in more detail, but this is a key problem facing the trading system. The objectives are much broader than the competencies of the trade regime. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't note another problem that the trading system faces, and that is regionalism. To some extent, this is a problem that is misunderstood in the academic literature, including by perhaps some members of the Princeton faculty. I wouldn't be surprised. But regionalism has been part and parcel of the multilateral trading system since its beginning. Indeed, one can argue that the United States Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act of 1934 provided much of the grist for the post-war GATT regime and the trading rules that were developed in the 1940s. Over much of the 60-year history of the GATT and WTO trading system, preferential trading agreements were a sideshow in international trade relations, with the notable exception of the agglomeration of the European Union. That's what regionalism was really about in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. Over the past 2 decades, however, there has been a sharp increase in bilateral and regional free trade agreements and customs unions, as well as new negotiations or proposed talks on what I would call super-regional arrangements, such as the free trade area of the Americas and the Western Hemisphere, discussions between the European Union and the Mercosur countries of South America, and the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, among others. There are more than 300 preferential trading arrangements that have been notified to the GATT and the WTO over the past 60 years. And some of these have become inactive or redundant as regional groupings expand, and as a result, the WTO now reports that fewer than 200 preferential trade agreements are currently in force. Is this good or bad for the trading system? A lot of academic economists, and particularly my friend Jagdish Bhagwati at Columbia, will say, yes, this is very bad. It creates all sorts of problems. But if you look at what is happening, in general, you can't say whether preferential trade arrangements are a boon or a bane of the trading system. It really depends on the scope and coverage of the agreements and the economic environment in which they are implemented. More recent studies particularly of the more comprehensive trade agreements, have shown that they are generally trade creating and supportive of the multilateral trading system, in part because they have been implemented in conjunction with ongoing multilateral trade liberalization. What this means is that you don't go into a preferential trade agreement for trade preferences, because the value, which may sound a little odd when it's said that starkly, but that's actually the fact. The value of those trade preferences depreciate very rapidly. As soon as multilateral trade liberalization is implemented, the wedge between the preferential rate and the MFN rate is reduced. As soon as another country is added to the free trade regime, or there's more competition in the market, and the value of that trade preference is diluted. And so this has happened invariably over the past 20 years. And there are few instances of significant trade diversion, except in the area of agriculture. The more important question is there investment diversion? And that is probably a more significant question for developing countries, and that's an issue that requires more examination by the academic community. But countries still rail about regionalism. It is a counterweight to negotiations in Geneva, and there are some resource diversion and attention diversion factors where some countries do not have the resources to pursue both bilateral, regional, and multilateral negotiations at the same time. Is this a big problem for the multilateral trading system? In the past, no. In the future, perhaps much more than in the past. Because if you have a decline in the pace of new multilateral trade liberalization, the incentives shift. And we've never had a situation in the post-war period where we haven't had ongoing multilateral trade liberalization. And so one cannot dismiss the criticisms that Jagdish Bhagwati and others put forward about regionalism in this new world of declining productivity of multilateral trade negotiations. That's an issue. It's up in the air, but I think it is worth the time the extra time that I spent on this point. There are a number of other issues that are a problem, but I think what I should note is you can't have a list of problems with any institution without saying that part of the problem is the lawyers. You have to blame the lawyers. And I know the lawyers who crafted the agreement to establish the World Trade Organization. And they're very good. They're very competent, and they were very successful in doing what they set out to do. They wanted to focus on making the trading institution work better. And they did that. And they provided a much more efficient and effective dispute settlement mechanism to go with it. But what they needed to do was make a system to rethink what the system should be working on rather than just make it work better on what it did in the past. And that was the big failing, has been the big failing of the WTO so far. It was an improvement on the trading system, focusing on the trading problems of the 20th century, not on the new trade problems that have to be dealt with in the 21st century. So what is that? That's the last part of my commentary. Reinforcing the multilateral trading system, what needs to be done? Well, the first thing that needs to be done is very practical. The countries have to go back and finish the Doha round. There has never been a failed multilateral trade negotiation, and if you have one, as I said earlier, it could do a great deal of damage to the credibility and support for using the multilateral trade forum in the future. So it's very difficult to think about reforming the WTO unless you can first complete the work of the Doha round to ensure that countries still think it's worth investing the time and effort and political capital into that type of reform. Then you have to look at reform. The WTO as an institution must respond to globalization pressures and adapt its work to fit changing conditions in world markets. And this will require changes in the way the WTO works and with whom it works. And there are three, I think, interrelated challenges facing the WTO, and I'll summarize them very briefly. The first challenge is to multilateralize multilateralism. Now, this may sound strange. We have a multilateral system. Why do we have to multilateralize it? The fundamental obligations of the WTO, the trading system, are most favored nation treatment and national treatment. These have been embodied from the beginning in GATT Articles 1 and 3. However, there are a vast number of exceptions that take the WTO far away from the ideal of a universal system with a single set of rules. In other words, a lot of trade protection is WTO legal because there are all sorts of special rules. That's why WTO negotiations are needed to develop new disciplines over such practices, but it's also why the absence of success in these areas has led countries to continue to use anti-dumping and other types of measures. These exceptions, I think, can be classified in 5 main categories: import remedies, such as anti-dumping and countervailing duties and general import and balance of payment safeguards, regulatory exceptions, and regional trading arrangements, developing country preferences provided under various special and differential treatment provisions that have evolved over the 6 decades, and in carve-outs negotiated in the national schedules of each WTO member country. Not every concession is granted to every country. When you negotiate these deals in Geneva, you write the details very finely in your national schedule, and the way you write them can discriminate very directly against some countries and in favor of others. So taken together, it is very hard to say that multilateral equals most favored nation. There is a big, wide gap in that needs to be redressed. And the WTO members would do well to fill many of the holes in the MFN gaps. The broad exceptions in the GATT provisions, in Article 20, which is a general exceptions provision, and Article 21 that cover national security exceptions, I think those deserve priority attention because security and environmental problems pose new challenges to the WTO system, and I'll mention that in just a moment. But that's the first challenge, multilateralizing multilateralism. The second challenge is to multilateralize regionalism. And my friend Richard Baldwin has done a lot of writing on this and has just come out with a new book that contains papers that were given at a big conference at the WTO a year and a half ago. The book is called Multilateralizing Regionalism. And it accepts the premise that preferential trade agreements will continue to proliferate because there are good reasons why countries do this with their neighbors, for foreign policy reasons, to track investment, all sorts of reasons. The challenge is to make the design and implementation of these agreements more WTO friendly and less likely to distort, to discriminate, and divert trade and investment. The vast literature on this subject offers a multitude of proposals. Most are theoretically sound, but flawed in terms of political economy considerations. In other words, they're easier to discuss than to negotiate and legislate and get political support for in national legislatures. There have been discussions on how to do this by promoting open regionalism, though there is no consensus regarding the practical application of this concept, but the idea would be to sort of allow anyone who can meet the rules of the club to join the club as soon as they're ready. The problem with that type of approach is that legislative bodies that ratify preferential agreements seldom like to issue blank checks for free access to their markets. This is a fundamental lesson of political economy that I hope is taught in the university, but it isn't part of the theory of international trade. But if you think about it, look at the agreements that have accession clauses, and if you look at them, you'll find that they're never used. Countries don't do that because they don't want to offer this blank check to allow new members to come in, because when new members come in, there's more competition for their domestic industries. There are also ways to multilateralize regionalism by improving the rules of origin, which are used to discriminate and determine who qualifies for trade preferences. In terms of design, the best approach to origin rules is to avoid industry-specific provisions and to minimize domestic content requirements. But actually, the simplest solution is the one that I've been advocating for a long time, but which is perhaps a little more difficult to implement, and that is, if you want to reduce the distortions caused by rules of origin, the best solution is to cut the MFN tariffs and thus reduce the margin of preference, essentially diluting the value of trade preferences until the regional preference and the MFN tariff are the same, and then you have global free trade. That's a clean, economically efficient way to do it, but the economist's potion for resolving this problem is castor oil to politicians. Because for politicians, they want to be able to say they've granted trade liberalization with one hand and then pulled it back with the other through rules of origin that limit the effect of that competition in their marketplace. That's what happens. Final, since I've been droning on for quite a bit, there's a need to modernize multilateralism. And this will require both a healthy dose of institutional reform as well as a review of the substance of the issues under consideration in the trading system. Key areas for institutional reform include the decision-making process, how you reach consensus, because with so many countries now in the World Trade System, not the 23 that signed the GATT in 1947, but now there are 153 members of the WTO. It's going to be important to develop a system of coalitional politics so that consensus can be put together and maintained among very diverse groups of countries of different size and levels of development. There will also be a need to reform the dispute settlement procedures in anticipation of increased caseload of gray area legal measures as we get into the issue of regulatory policies. The GATT rules were not designed to fit the new globalized economy that now is in operation, and the lawyers will have to try to parse out how the rules apply to very different types of trade practices and regulatory regimes than those that existed at the time of the drafting of these rules. And this applies also to the subsidy rules that I wrote 35 years ago, because now we have concerns about manipulating currency. Is that an implicit subsidy? Not enforcing labor standards. Is that impose implicit benefits or protective benefits for one firm or another? There are whole issues of what is an implicit subsidy that now are the subject of a great deal of debates in national legislatures and in the negotiating forums in Geneva. So going forward, the WTO will have to adapt its substantive agenda to the new demands of globalization and the political imperatives of sustaining coalitions in support of multilateral initiatives. WTO rules on taxes and subsidies need to be recast to meet the new challenges of global warming and to respond to demands that the definition of subsidy, as I just mentioned, and thus the scope of permitted countervailing measures against distorting or prohibited subsidies, be made infinitely elastic to cover concerns about currency manipulation, regulatory abuse or neglect, and labor market practices. And in addition, members will have to address trade and security linkages before pre-shipment inspection and visa requirements become major obstacles to international flows of goods, services, and people. To be sure, this will create tension between those seeking policy coherence versus those resisting agenda overload. Either way, however, it's going to be good news for the political science faculty because these are key issues that are going to need further elaboration and analysis in the academic community. Because many of these subjects require negotiation into areas beyond the expertise and competencies of trade officials, the WTO will have to collaborate more effectively with other international economic organizations. And there is very little collaboration that is between organizations. And indeed, if you think about it, there's very little collaboration within national governments in these areas. Try to get a Treasury official to talk to somebody from the Commerce Department. This exchange rates are my business. Commerce, get your hands off or there'll be a big turf battle. Well, you have this in every government. And it's even worse when the economic ministries compete with the foreign foreign ministries. And then when you add domestic policies, whether it be labor or health concerns, then you get additional bureaucratic walls built up that block coordination. And indeed, one of the interesting experiments of the Obama administration is setting up all these new coordinating offices in the White House to deal with cross-cutting issues of energy and the environment or whatever. Will this work, or will this just be an additional bureaucratic overlay that masks the differences? That'll be a big issue, but it exists in the trading system right now by just the pure coincidence of personal relationships between the head of the WTO, Pascal Lamy, and the head of the World Bank, Bob Zoellick, the head of the OECD, the head of the International Labor Organization. There are personal relationships where these organizations are working together, but there's no institutional ties that will maintain the institutional memory or create a foundation for continued work once these gentlemen leave their posts. And so a big problem that needs to be dealt with, working with the IMF, the WTO working with the IMF, the World Bank, on related trade, finance, exchange rate, and development issues going forward, but also with many other countries, organizations. I'm almost at the end, so bear with me, just one or two more points. There are also probably, and this will create a lot of consternation with developing countries, despite the ideological objections and practical concerns of those countries, there will also probably be a need to deal with trade and labor issue, building on the constructive principles on labor rights and conditions of work developed over the past decade in the International Labor Organization. And this will be a very contentious issue. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, WTO members will face the daunting task of balancing trade and environmental objectives, now that the latter has grown to climactic proportions, since it is not clear what body would be the obvious interlocutor on the environmental side. This challenge to the trading system dealing with climate change is really difficult. Pricing carbon and committing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions will affect, if you think about it, what we produce, how we produce it, and where we produce it. So at its core, it involves charging for previously free goods for carbon, which ultimately will result in some reallocation of wealth both within countries and between countries. So when carbon taxes and regulatory mandates raise the cost of producing goods, firms will come under competitive stress. And having this happen now at a time of deep recession even makes this competitive concern even greater. Their responses will be improve productivity if they can, relocate if they must, halt production, that's always an option, and or lobby for protection via subsidy, free carbon permits, and import restrictions. And that you always will find because the lawyers are there touting their ability to get protection rents. These problems already have surfaced, with threats of trade protection echoing in Brussels and in Washington. Now that Obama's budget has signaled a long-term commitment to a national cap and trade system to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, we are likely to see a crush of lobbyists raising warning flags about U.S. competitiveness and petitioning for financial aid and import relief. The U.S. debate will be emulated in other countries, you can be sure of that, propelling a new wave of subsidies and trade protection. And the WTO will have to respond in a manner that promotes progress on both economic and environmental goals. And that's going to be a tremendous challenge because it hasn't done anything in this area yet. So put this all together in sum, the trading system in the 21st century must be re-engineered. And doing so at a time of deep economic stress is going to be very difficult. The WTO's legal architects effectively sought to restore the structural integrity of the International Trade Organization that emerged from the Havana Conference in the 1940s. They did so, but their plan was flawed, not because it wasn't ambitious, but because it wasn't ambitious enough. And doing that to preserve the gains of integration and globalization that we have achieved over the past 50 years is going to be a big challenge for the major trading nations going forward. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer questions on this or any assorted Washington-related question that I can handle. Yes, sir.
Professor, what do you think the outcome will be of our breach of NAFTA regarding the Mexican trucks and their retaliation by putting tariff on 95 of our products?
Well, I actually was in Mexico when that happened and talked to some of the top officials. The United States has been in violation of our NAFTA obligations for 8 years now. 8 years ago, a NAFTA panel ruled that the U.S. policy was a violation. Mexico had a right to retaliate since 2001 and deferred doing so because the Bush administration was trying to find a way to solve the problem. And they developed a pilot program that the Congress rejected last year and that then was killed in the in legislation in the start of the Obama administration. It does neither of us any good to have these restrictions and retaliation. The Mexican retaliation was actually very tempered, considering if you look at the products that were subject to the new duties. And the Obama administration has already put together a internal team to try to come up with some alternative pilot program that would be differentiated from what the Bush administration did and hopefully provide a means to bring the U.S. back into compliance with its NAFTA obligations. Probably won't be developed quickly because at its heart the U.S. position is based on protectionism. The Teamsters don't want competition from Mexican truckers. There are safety concerns, but many of those have been substantially addressed, probably not totally addressed, in the various pilot programs. So I think there will be an effort before the president goes to Mexico in 2 weeks to start a new consultation. And it'll probably take 6 to 9 months to work out some scheme. I'm hopeful that they will find a way to begin, at least at some limited basis, to resume the pilot program so that Mexican trucks can operate in the United States. There's a huge problem at our borders because of the existing rules that require Mexican trucks to unload and load their cargoes onto U.S. trucks. It's not just costing money or adding to transport costs, but it also creates big environmental problems in the border areas because you've got all these trucks hanging around belching smoke. So it would be a good idea for us to get out of that problem. It would be a good idea for Mexico to allow U.S. trucks in Mexico because they would benefit from more competition as well. But we've got lots of problems on NAFTA. Fortunately, this one, Obama immediately said he would try to work on developing an alternative solution. Yes, sir.
Professor, one of your recommendations, or the key recommendation, is to go finish the Doha round.
Yes.
Now, there was talk earlier of doing it at a high level of ambition. Would you recommend finishing it even at a low level of ambition if it has to be done quickly?
Well, that has never been, in my view, a good way of describing what an agreement would have to be. An agreement has to balance the political forces that benefit from the liberalization from the political forces that suffer from the adjustment from the new competition. So if you have a low level of ambition, what you're essentially saying is you're not going to change existing policies very much. And that may be what is desired in terms of the overall result in the Doha round at this point, given a lot of the obstacles. The calculus of what is a benefit is difficult. In the past, groups said unless there is actual change in existing trade barriers, then there's nothing new and there's no new benefit. And that calculus was based on the assumption that the status quo was sustainable and that the existing level of protection would not increase. But now we've seen in the last 6-9 months that actually the protection is increasing. And so there is a great deal of benefit to be gained from creating disciplines that make it harder to raise protection legally under the WTO. This is a long way of saying that the value of reducing WTO bindings, the maximum level of protection that you can provide for a good or a service, down to the current levels that are applied, has a great deal of value in reducing the flexibility to increase protection and increasing the security of the policy environment, which is a benefit to businesses as they're planning their investment strategies. And I think more and more we're seeing that in agriculture, with regard to agricultural subsidies, there is a great value in reducing the flexibility to increase subsidies or to increase tariffs, and will likely come out more of that. That said, an important component of the equation is not just agriculture and manufacturers, but services. And there has been almost no negotiations on services in the 7.5 years of the Doha round. And unless there is some benefit on services, it's going to be hard to construct a political coalition in the United States, in Europe, and possibly even in India that would allow a package to come together. So I'm working with Pascal Lamy on some ideas on ways of reviving the talks, recognizing that no hard political decisions are likely to be able to be taken by governments until their economies have begun recovering, and that's likely 2010 at the earliest. But there is a lot of detailed work on tariff line by tariff line, service sector by service sector that negotiators have to work on to determine what the terms of their national schedules will be. That's what a trade negotiation is really about, and we haven't had any negotiation in the Doha round negotiations, essentially. We've been talking about the shape of the rules and not actually sitting down and negotiating the potential results as they apply to specific products and services. Getting into that next phase, I think, is important. And what Pascal Lamy hopes to see out of the London summit on Thursday is a call to say, let's move past the so-called modalities for negotiations that have been developed in Geneva and get to the negotiating table and start talking about real goods and services. Yes, sir.
Could you just go for a few minutes on the effect of China entering the WTO and what their negotiating position has been in the recent negotiations?
Well, China joined at the end of 2001, and on terms, you could say, which were much more onerous than almost any other developing country. China committed in its WTO accession to a much more open market for goods and services than almost any other developing country. And so its bindings were already down to close to its applied rates, unlike many developing countries that have a huge gap and therefore the flexibility to increase protection. That was very significant, and it was by design, and the Chinese policy was designed in the WTO was designed to help Chinese officials manage the massive adjustment in the Chinese economy that has been taking place over the past decade. Manage it by bringing in new import competition when needed, but also using the WTO tools, whether it be anti-dumping or other measures, to moderate the competition when it was necessary. And China has been one of the foremost users of anti-dumping. So all of that, as a first point, is China's been very constructive in the terms of entry. China was very quiet for most of the negotiations, taking a back seat until 2003. It joined with Brazil and other countries in a so-called G20, trade G20, in the Cancun Ministerial of the WTO in September 2003. And that group was trying to push for broader commitments by the United States and Europe on agricultural trade liberalization. So that was the real extent of Chinese push until very recently. It would take a back seat. It used its position in that developing country caucus to moderate the excessive demands of India on agriculture. And in that sense, it was very constructive. And indeed, in the breakup of the Cancun Ministerial, which broke apart with much rancor, China was one of the few countries that Bob Zoellick, then the USTR, commended for its constructive role during that meeting. But if you look at it, what China did was not commensurate with its size or vested interest in the world trading system. And there was an effort to get China to take more of a leadership role, at least join the leadership steering group that was evolving during the course of the negotiations. And it did so only last July. And when it agreed to this broader group of 7 countries, there was a great deal of hope that China would be the catalyst that would lead to a breakthrough in the negotiations, and that the round would then take off. That was July 2008. But unfortunately, when you're new at this game, you sometimes make some diplomatic missteps, and there were a couple of miscommunications, and people were walking on eggshells, essentially in Geneva at the time, and the negotiations fell apart. China was initially blamed, though subsequently there has been some pullback on those accusations. But the talk stopped. And now the question is, what role for China? And China, like all the other WTO members, is focusing first on getting its own house in order and trying to make sure that it can deal with adjustment. And for China, it's a big adjustment, going from a peak growth rate of over 13%, in their peak quarters, down now this year they'll grow, 6.5%. It looks good to everybody else in the world, but given the size of the massive adjustments in the Chinese economy and society, it means they have much less resources to play with in managing that adjustment. So they're going to be diverted for some time. I think China, in the end, will play a constructive role, if for no other reason that the changes that would be required of China won't make that much difference. A 50% cut in tariffs from 8% to 4% doesn't make that much of a difference to Chinese competitiveness in world markets or to foreign competitiveness in the Chinese market. And so they'll be able to do it. They just don't want to be out front and for political reasons based on their relations with other developing countries. So that's a sensitivity that will be managed. But I think China will end up being a constructive partner. India will be a little more problematic. Yes, sir.
I have a friend who's a Princeton alum and claims that he was a member of the world's second oldest profession, spice broker. So trade has always been around, but not every country grew spices. It seems to me free trade has decimated the industrial base of this country unnecessarily, and led to other distortions. I work with people on the margins, sometimes in Trent, industrial town at one time, and I think it's led to some structural unemployment where there are people that would have worked in the factories that just don't have other satisfactory things. Everybody says, well, education is the key. I tell you, I work with people who will not get any more education no matter what you do. And I think that's one of the dangers, and it also seems that one of the aggravating factors for the mortgage meltdown was the availability of money that had gone out on foreign trade and became a hot potato and got invested in mortgages we didn't have enough of them. We had to pay more and more to satisfy the demand. So I'll just say that maybe something like everybody talks about flat taxes. I don't think they're really practical, but what about a flat tariff as a first order approximation, maybe in the size of flat taxes, 15 or 20%, just to try to, all things being equal, say that the U.S., for instance, prefers domestic production to a certain extent, not to the point of protectionism, but somewhere between protectionism and total freedom of tariffs. Is that a thought that, well, I've said a lot of things. I'm just interested in your response.
Well, the first thing is that a lot of the stresses and the adjustment pressures in our industrial economy are not related to trade. We have a big market. Our market was substantially closed until very recently. to foreign competition. Closed in the sense of the trade to GDP ratio. We essentially had such a big market that most companies didn't have to worry about foreign competition. They just served the local market. Most of the stresses do not come from import competition. They come from technological change. And one of the concerns in the public debate is not that we want to stop technological change or innovation. We want to encourage that, because that boost of productivity is what allows the increase in real wages. But there has been a concern that there isn't an adequate safety net. So you're absolutely right. Education is the long-term answer, but it doesn't do someone like me any good. If I had to compete against my research assistants, if I could go back 40 years ago, I'd never compete with them. They know so much more than I did then, and I'm almost uneducable anymore. But the problem is there's no safety net. And the real anxiety in the industrial economy is not just that you lose your job because a company is under stress, but you lose your health insurance, and you may lose your home, and like that is a kitchen table issue and a great concern, and it causes a great deal of anxiety, not just the unemployed, and not just during a recession, but this is during the boom times we had these problems, because people thought, well, if I lose my job, I'm in the soup, and my family's in the soup, and a catastrophic illness could wipe us out. So those types of concerns, I think, there has been an effort to try to find a way to express or group all of these concerns together in the public debate. And Senator Clinton tried to do that during the Democratic primaries last year. And she came up with a bumper sticker that tried to encapsulate all the concerns about globalization. And she called it NAFTA. And privately, she admitted that NAFTA was a surrogate for a lot of the problems of adjustment in the 21st century world economy. But it's too hard to explain globalization on a bumper sticker or a paragraph. It's easier to say NAFTA and the poor Mexicans stealing our jobs, taking our factories, sending us, having unqualified truckers driving on our roads. These are all elements of insecurity. So the answer is not adding a 15% tariff, because that's making the producers. That means that producers who buy components are going to pay more, and the cost of production is going to be more, and they're going to become less competitive compared to other firms producing in other countries where we may try to win sales through our exports. The better thing is to have a better reallocation of the gains from trade and the gains from globalization. But that has to come through overall economic policy. It would be better to do that in a tempered way and try to redress some of the imbalances that have built up over decades. The Obama administration is now trying to take it all on in a period of a vastly shrinking economy, and so you get all the concerns about overload and increasing taxes during a recession, and a lot of the political blame game that is part and parcel of life in Washington. But the cure is not trade protection. That is just adding a tax that will wash out in the exchange rate anyway. And that's just changing the allocation between various interest groups in our own economy. So I think we have to recognize that there are losers to globalization. There are losers when there's technological change. And we have to have a better system for dealing with them, their families, and their communities. And we're going to have this problem in spades now with the auto industry, with the downsizing of GM and Chrysler and Ford, because huge concentration of communities in Michigan and Ohio that are going to be affected. And where's the investment coming in, particularly in a time of deep economic stress? We've had that type of adjustment in other parts of our country, but over a longer period of time. The textile mills in South Carolina are a lot of them are gone. Some of them have retooled and are competitive, but there's a lot more employment in South Carolina, building BMWs and other goods that are actually providing higher paid jobs. So how do you get that happy ending where there is a period of stress? There is no easy answer, and we're going to pay for the benign neglect of many decades of policy where we ignored our social safety net. I should say, on the other hand, Europe has perhaps gone too far in the other direction, and they've suffered from not having insufficient productivity and innovation in their economies because their labor markets are less flexible, and they've had lower employment because companies don't hire workers because you can't fire them. So there's got to be some happy medium, but that's got to be determined by the national political process and how they allocate the rents across the economy. Not a convincing argument, perhaps, and a multifaceted one, but one that requires debate, and not just a simplistic debate about NAFTA's bad and NAFTA represents this and that, but more about how all of the different pieces of the global economy fit together and how they affect individual firms and workers. I think we have time for one or no, we don't have time?
One more.
Yes, sir.
I wonder why you believe that to finish first the Doha round is necessary before engaging in reform of the WTO. Could that process not go in parallel? Or isn't the failure or almost failure of Doha round proof that the reform is needed and new procedures, new processes are necessary to get the WTO running?
Well, the institutional reform could proceed in the sense that you could create, you could do some of the rulemaking on dispute settlement. But what countries are really interested in is how are the negotiations dealing with the real problems that they're facing now, the new subsidies that will be afforded to auto firms as part of these bailout plans in Europe, in the United States, in Korea, elsewhere. How will climate change policies affect this? And there you need to have a substantive negotiation. And countries will say, well, why should we, and developing countries will say this primarily, why should we expand the negotiating agenda when you haven't been willing to discuss the priority issues that we put on the plate in Doha? And so I think you essentially have to cut your Doha deal and then say we've got to turn to the 21st century challenges. And this is not just doing business as we used to do it, but expanding the scope of the enterprise. so that there is more on the table in terms of trade reform, in terms of development finance, in terms of technical assistance, which will be a part of the climate change negotiations as well for developing countries, and combine that with some of the changes in the trading rules. So you really need a bigger package, but you need more on the table to create the balance of interests that I was talking about before. I think if you say, well, forget about Doha, let's start over, most of the members of the WTO are going to say, well, wait a second, that was our agenda, that was our priorities, and why should we forget that and sign on to your priorities? Do both would be great. But that's when you add to the agenda significantly, when you're talking about the climate change, when you're talking about a lot of these other substantive issues, you're diluting the leverage that developing countries have to get the United States and Europe to agree to more significant reforms on agriculture, which is one of their primary objectives. So, last word, because I know Patty is looking at me saying you're cutting into dinner time. The last word is developing countries may be forced to swallow that package. Why? Because as the weaker partners in the trading system, they have the most to lose from a collapse of a rules-based multilateral trading system. And I've tried to encourage developing country ambassadors to understand this, that at the end of the day, if the round fails, they are the big losers. The powerful countries can continue to do business and can make do. The weaker countries, if they lose the protection of the rules-based system, will be at a greater disadvantage. And so I think as these factors begin to percolate in Geneva, there will be more accommodation. And you've already seen this from Brazil. They are trying very hard now to bring developed and developing countries together to get a package, whether it is a modest ambition or not, so that you maintain the integrity of the multilateral negotiating process. I think that's better to do that, get that finished, and begin implementing, and start immediately on the new agenda. And there are ways of building in an agenda so you can go right from one negotiation into the next one. And I'm the eternal optimist on this. This is the most optimistic forecast you will hear on the Doha round in the WTO, I think, from any inside observer. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the time.